stuff you ask, Finding Joy in the Unknown. By Joey Lott. www.joeylott.com. A relatively short time ago, I started publishing books, blogs, and videos regarding what I'll call the obsessive insistence that something is wrong with this right now and the search to fix the supposed problem. Or, inversely, we can say that I communicate about the possibility of discovering peace in the belly of the beast. I believed myself to be caught up in intense suffering for a few decades, which is more than long enough. I searched for a solution, and yet the more I searched, the worse things seemed to get. I was washing my hands and counting and doing my damnedest to remain celibate, all things that seemed somehow really important, as if the whole universe depended upon my successful execution of these insane and inane practices and prohibitions. The level of anxiety was, so to speak, through the roof. I could barely sleep. I ended up very sick. One of the ways I searched for a solution was through so-called non-duality, which is to say I hoped that reading books by Sailor Bob Adamson and staring at photographs of Ramana Maharshi while repeating a mantra of "Who am I?" would magically end the unpleasant experiences. Along with all that, I also stared into candle flames, chanted badly mangled Sanskrit phrases, and meditated in full lotus when I probably should have been eating or sleeping again, all in hopes that it might stop the unpleasant experiences. If I had been smarter, perhaps it would have dawned on me that my strategies were not working and that perhaps, just perhaps, my entire goal was ill-conceived. But I wasn't that smart. So I kept on keeping on, doing more of the same old bullshit, but imagining that it was fresh and new each time. Until finally, miraculously, and completely in spite of all the deluded stuff I was doing in the search, the insanity of the whole search became obvious and the ever-presence and inescapability of peace came to be clear. Subsequently, what amazed me was how unnecessarily special much of what I had read and heard had seemed and how much bullshit had accompanied its presentation. Why, for example, had so many people in contemporary times and in Western cultures cluttered the simplicity of the essential message with Sanskrit names and Hindu gods? Why the pervasive capitalization of source, consciousness, and awareness? Why so much nonsense? So I wanted to offer some sanity to the mix. I started publishing and then invited people to ask their questions, express their doubts, or communicate whatever else they wanted. I started getting lots of emails, and I started speaking with lots of people by phone and Skype. Then I began an ongoing video question and answer series, which has invited even more questions. Out of all these questions that I receive, some themes repeatedly show up in various guises. In this book, I decided to address some of these common themes. In each of the sections that follow, you'll find an exploration of one of these themes, like cause and effect, free will, and why sometimes it seems as though experiences are your experiences. I invite you to explore, and in the exploration, unburden yourself of everything you think you know. Let go and discover the effortlessness of what is free will. One of the most common themes that comes up in the questions that I receive is the theme of free will, also known as the dreaded choice/no-choice quandary. In short, people hear the common non-duality message, which states that there is no free will, and this message seems to be in direct contradiction with what they imagine to be their experience. After all, it sure seems as though we make decisions all day long. So the assertion that there is no choice is often a major sticking point. That's unfortunate, because it is completely unnecessary. The matter needn't be understood. In fact, it can't be understood. In a certain sense, this requires an act of faith, and that is uncomfortable for most of us because we imagine that we have to understand. But hopefully, with a little exploration, it will become clear that discomfort and ignorance are not a problem. In fact, the discovery that discomfort and ignorance are, like everything else, meaningless and without a reference point is the discovery of peace, as we'll see. The free will issue can be an affront for many of us. The mere fact that it rubs us the wrong way or seems so offensive raises our hackles and we get defensive. Normally, when we feel defensive, we simply indulge the habitual conditioned response. In other words, we defend and protect. Unfortunately, this can blind us to what is absolutely and perfectly obvious, which is the peace and freedom of choicelessness and ignorance. This peace and freedom is always available, in fact, that is all that is. But the compulsive armoring and defensiveness causes an overlooking of what is obvious. What is obvious is that there is nothing to cling to and nothing to defend. But in the indulgence of the compulsion to know, understand, and protect, we miss the obvious and instead mistake belief or imagination for reality. In imagination, it is possible to believe that anything is true. In fact, we can even believe in that which is intangible, invisible, inaudible, and otherwise non-existent. I often refer to this as the Santa Claus syndrome, or the invisible 900-pound gorilla syndrome. We cannot disprove the existence of that which does not exist, and because the doubt remains, we can make the mistake of acting as if the non-existent thing might exist. We cannot prove that there is no Santa Claus. Even if we send a team of the world's smartest, most capable people to the North Pole to try to prove that there is no residence there and no evidence of Santa Claus, or Mrs. Claus or the elves or reindeer, the mere fact that they cannot find anything doesn't actually prove that there is no Santa Claus, that only means that he hasn't been found. Of course, it may seem ridiculous to imagine a scenario in which adults would take Santa Claus so seriously that they'd actually try to find him. After all, no adults believe in Santa Claus, right? But what if, instead of the words Santa Claus, we consider the word God? The God myth is similar to the Santa Claus myth except that unlike Santa Claus, millions of adults actually believe in gods of various sorts. And millions of otherwise intelligent people will actually argue over whose fantasy is real and whose is made up. Even within a particular sect in which the people have some consensus among themselves regarding the fantasy to which they subscribe, there can be heated arguments. Does God accept or reject gay people? Does God get angry when women's faces are seen? Did God really give humans dominion over the earth? Of course, if you're reading this book, then chances are you don't subscribe to either of these myths. You probably don't lose sleep on Christmas Eve worrying whether Santa will be pleased or not with the cookie selection you've left him. You did leave some cookies, didn't you? And you probably stopped believing in God a while ago. Though, admit it, you're still slightly afraid that you have made his shit list and will regret taking his name in vain come the rapture. But when it comes to the separate self, well, you're still in the grips of that one. The thing is, no matter how much you believe, there still is no Santa Claus. And no matter how much you believe, there is no God Almighty who will strike you down for your sins. In the same way, no matter how pervasive the belief, no matter how unquestioned the assumptions, there is no separate self. Still, people get hung up on this. They say, but I choose stuff. I can choose to lift my hand. See. I just lifted my hand. I chose it. I made the decision. Right. And Santa Claus brought you that Rudolph sweater and God answered your prayers for a raise at work. The mere fact that shit happens, apparently, doesn't prove that anyone did it. And that is the key to this whole puzzle. If you wake up on Christmas morning to find a present under a tree, does that mean that Santa Claus came down your chimney? You do have a chimney, don't you? And delivered it while his sleigh and reindeer team were parked on the roof. And if you get a raise at work, does that mean that God made it happen because you said 25 Hail Marys? The problem is that we often begin with a belief that is totally unchallenged, and we then interpret everything from that perspective. So if you begin with the belief that there is a God who judges, rewards, and punishes, then whatever happens can be fit into that story. If you get a raise at work, then it was an answer to your prayer. On the other hand, if you get fired, then it must be God's will, and it's because He's got better plans for you. Right? Same thing goes for the separate self. Start with the unchallenged belief in a separate self, and then when thinking seems to happen, it must be me doing the thinking, or when a hand moves, it must be me moving the hand. But why? Did you ever look to see if the thinker can be found? What about the decider? What about the mover? What about the experiencer? Like Santa Claus or God, you cannot find the separate self. But neither can you absolutely disprove that it exists. Santa Claus might have purchased a state-of-the-art cloaking device from the Klingons, making it impossible to find him or his home up there in the north. And God is omnipotent, so that could explain why he's so hard to find. We can use the same sort of logic with the separate self. It could be, as many have postulated, that the separate self is the one who is looking, and like an eye cannot see itself, the separate self cannot see itself. Which could be the case. But why should we assume the existence of something for which there is no proof? In fact, there is not a shred of evidence. As soon as I say there is no evidence, people get offended. So again, defenses are raised. Wait a second. You say. You're trying to pull a fast one on me. Really? Why so defensive? Why so protective of what you cannot find? And here's where the act of faith is required. Remember, I told you that it might be uncomfortable. That's because you cannot know that there is no separate self. You cannot prove it. That is offensive to the conventional sensibilities that insist that we must know things, we need to understand, or so we imagine. But let's see if that's true. Do you need to understand? Will understanding offer anything of value? Let's walk through this logically. Whatever is what is. This is a statement that you cannot reasonably argue against. In fact, it is so obviously true that it may seem absurd that I would even make the statement. But it's a good starting point because this much we can agree is actually true. What is. Simple. Next, the question is, does what is require belief or understanding to be? The answer, in case you were wondering, is no. No belief or understanding is necessary. What is, regardless of belief or understanding. In fact, any belief or understanding that seems to be, is merely what is. Sometimes this is not so obvious, so it's worth exploring in a bit more detail. Let's consider the phenomenon that we call sunrise. Does that phenomenon require belief or understanding? For example, if you believed that the sunrise would not happen, would that have any effect? If you're uncertain, then test it out. The sun will rise regardless of belief. What if you didn't understand it? What if you had no concept of sun or rising or sky or anything else? Would the phenomenon change as a result of no understanding? In case you were wondering, the answer is no, it would not. If the sun rises and the thought occurs, the sun is rising, does that mean that you made the sun rise? Answer, no. Now, let's say that a hand rises. Is belief or understanding required for that phenomenon to happen? Notice that I didn't suggest anything about your hand rising, just a hand rising. Does that require belief or understanding? Obviously, it does not. Like the sunrise, a hand raising is merely what is happening. But what about your hand? This is where we usually get defensive. You might say, of course, my hand rising is different than any other hand rising, because raising my hand is an act of volition. Okay. Now, take a look. Can you find the one who makes the choice and raises the hand? What is it that makes your hand different? Is it really different, or is it only that there is a belief that it is different? And notice that, even without the belief, the phenomenon remains the same. In other words, the belief in a chooser and the belief in volition have nothing to do with the phenomenon that we call hand rising. The belief is just a belief. That is all. Wait a second. You say. Not so fast. It's different because I feel my hand rising whereas I don't feel other hands rising. Okay. So what? There is feeling that happens. But how do you know that feeling means anything? How is the feeling proof of volition? And more to the point, is the feeling proof of a separate self? Can you find the one who feels? Is there a findable reference point? In actuality, shit happens. That is all that can be said. It has no reference point. There is no findable separate self. The belief is that some of what happens is volitional, while other stuff is not. For example, while a sunrise is not volitional, raising your hand is. But when we look, even the so-called volitional stuff is no different than everything else. It is only shit happening with a belief that it is referencing a chooser. But where's the chooser? Or, if you're from Crawford, Texas, where's the decider? Can you find it? All along, we've assumed that the mere existence of a phenomenon requires that someone chooses. We believed that life is like a choose-your-own-adventure story in which many different paths can be chosen. But all of this is based on a belief without any actual evidence in support of the theory, since in actual experience, no matter what, there is only what is happening, never something else. And unlike a choose-your-own-adventure story, you can't go back and choose differently. Perhaps you've noticed. Stuff happens, but by virtue of the fact that only what happens actually happens, meaning nothing else happens other than what does, we cannot even meaningfully say that any choices ever occur. Instead, stuff just happens. And then, when we look, we cannot even find the one to whom it is all supposedly happening. There's just the happening. That's it. No one is choosing it. No one is experiencing it. And that's always been the case. So this discovery doesn't change anything. Yet the discovery allows for the possibility of seeing what is as it is rather than as it is imagined to be. And strangely, that can seem to make all the difference. But you can't do that. You can't choose to see what is as it is. Why? Because the chooser cannot be found. In other words, there is no chooser. But strangely, by simply looking, the inherent piece that is already the case is seen. Okay. Now don't worry, because I'm already steps ahead of you. I am anticipating your next doubt, because invariably the question arises, who chooses to look? Who sees peace? The problem with those questions is that they seek to understand. But this is not something that can be understood. Rather, it can be seen or experienced directly. And no one does that. No one sees or experiences. To the compulsion to understand, this response is infuriating and completely dissatisfying. But let's get real for a moment, that compulsion to understand has never made good on its promise. It promises that understanding is always right around the corner and that upon understanding peace will finally be yours forever. But that compulsion, like all compulsion, just like the intense hand-washing compulsion I indulged for years, is pure deceit. It is a lie. It has never made good on its promise. So stop believing it. If you want peace, then stop. Right now. Don't plan to stop. Just stop. Just for a second. Don't worry about forever or 5 minutes from now or even 5 seconds from now. Just for a second, right now, let everything go. Relax the compulsion to understand, to know, to protect, to solve, to be okay. Give it up just for a second. Rest. Really rest. Just for a second. Or hell, just for a millisecond if a full second is too much. Even just a fraction of a millisecond is enough. Rest completely. And in this one instant, this one timeless moment, does anything matter? Is anything missing? Is there any problem right now? See. Understanding is not necessary. In fact, the indulgence of the compulsion to understand is the only problem. It's the same as the compulsion to solve a problem. It's the same as the compulsion to be okay. It's the same as the compulsion to protect your self-esteem or your self-image or whatever else you've mistaken yourself to be. But when there is complete rest for just a second, then simple, ordinary peace is obvious. Nothing needs to be done. This is it. As soon as the question is pursued as if it mattered of who chose to rest or who chose to let go or who experienced rest or who was aware or any of the rest of the nonsense that gets treated as if it were important, then there is suffering once again. Then it is imagined that there is someone who needs to understand, someone at the center of it all, some experiencer. But once again, take a look. Right now, let go, rest, relax, drop it all. Is anything actually needed? Is anything actually missing? Is anything actually wrong? Just right now, is there a problem? I'm not talking about conceptual problems. I'm talking about right now, before there is even time for thought to appear. Is there a problem? This is it. Don't look for anything else. There is nothing else. There is only this. Looking for it. Another extraordinarily common theme is one that ranges from overt to subtle, the looking for it theme. And it is often known by other names such as self, consciousness, awareness, God, spirit, source, and other capitalized words. There are many forms of this theme. Sometimes it is expressed in terms of proximity such as, I am almost there or I have almost realized myself. Other times it is expressed as a negation, which is a dead giveaway, I have given up the search for consciousness. Sometimes it is even expressed as having already been attained, but with a problem still occurring, as in, I've seen through the false notions of self and realized my true nature as being. But I still want to meditate. Is that a problem? No matter what the specifics, all the many variations have one thing in common, which is that there remains an unquestioned assumption. Namely, that there is something to be found, something other than this, and someone to find it. To make matters worse, we often not only don't question the assumptions, but we even seek to deceive others, and ourselves. In regard to the nature of the search, we learn that it isn't kosher in non-duality or orthodoxy to seek, and so we start lying about the seeking that is apparently happening. In my view, it is useful to be completely honest and transparent. Just get your cards all out on the table, so to speak. What are you searching for? What are you hoping for? What is the carrot that keeps the seeking/suffering going? Once it's all on the table, you can see it for what it is and see that it never was what you had imagined. There never was anything to attain. It was just a fantasy, no more sophisticated than the heaven myth. Basically, it was just the hope that things could be other than they are, which is insane and stressful, in case you hadn't noticed. What were you hoping for? Don't worry about it being foolish, since it most assuredly is. But it's not personal either. So don't mind the discomfort, the images, the thoughts, the memories, the concepts, or any of the rest of the stuff that suggests otherwise. Just tell the truth. What were you hoping for? No more pain? No discomfort? Just bliss and grooviness? A really good high happening endlessly? Like the best part of the best sex you've ever had, happening without interruption? Maybe you had some silly ideas. Or, even more likely, you weren't even all that clear about what you were after, you just knew it had to be something else, something other than what is. Because it was always assumed that what is isn't it, whatever it might be. We talk about it so much, we find groups that support us in searching for it, and we completely overlook the fact that it can't be found. And it doesn't matter what you call it. It doesn't matter how many letters you capitalize. It doesn't matter whether you place it in quotation marks. It doesn't matter whether the Buddha supposedly said it or Jesus supposedly said it or Eckhart Tolle supposedly said it or Papaji supposedly said it. It doesn't matter, because whatever you have been searching for is a lie. It doesn't exist. There is no enlightenment. There is no nirvana. There is no awakening. because this is all that is. Not only is nothing else necessary, nothing else is possible. This right now, as it is already the totality. Just because the idea of this doesn't seem to match the idea of what totality is imagined to be doesn't mean otherwise. The way you can be assured that this is the totality is because nothing else can be found. The search for it, whatever you call it, and no matter how sophisticated the denial, is suffering for the simple reason that it is the search for what does not exist with the earnest belief that what is isn't good enough. In other words, the only reality there is has been convicted, without any evidence, of being insufficient, despite being the totality and therefore inherently sufficient, and all hopes have been pinned on the attainment of that which is not and therefore never can be attained. And just to put some icing on the cake, a simple look reveals that no one exists separate from what is in order to attain anything, much less what is not. Do you see the absolute insanity of the position? Unfortunately, even when the futility of searching for what is not has been seen, we often still resist the welcoming of what is. That's because although the fantasy of what was imagined to be the savior has been seen through, the assumption that this right now, as it is, isn't enough goes unchallenged. Normally we simply assume that this right now is a problem somehow. This is imagined to be deficient, unpleasant, unacceptable, and unwelcome. If this seemingly includes discomfort, pain, loss, grief, sorrow, fear, anger, or anything else that has been deemed bad, then that is assumed to be proof that this is not enough. But instead, take a look. See if it's true. For just 1 second, let go. Don't try to understand what is happening. Don't give any effort to judging it. Be so lazy that you can't be bothered to give any energy to any thought or any concept. Let it all happen as it does, but don't get involved. Just for 1 second. Rest completely. In this instant before the next thought is believed, before any story is accepted as truth, in the rest and ignorance that is inherent in this moment of doing nothing, can you be certain that there is a problem? Is there anything missing from this moment? Is it deficient in any way? Even if there is pain, discomfort, disease, sorrow, anger, anxiety, or fear, is that a problem? Should it be otherwise? Could it be otherwise right now? Before the next thought occurs, before what is can be conceptualized and compared to some fantasy of what isn't it perfectly clear and obvious that this is all that is? There is nothing else. When it is seen that there is only this, the habit of searching for something else doesn't necessarily stop. Why should it? That habit never had anything to do with there actually being something else. It was only just happening, like everything else. It was always meaningless, and now that the simplicity of ignorance and unknowing is seen, the phenomenon of searching for something else remains meaningless. No separate self exists to search or to stop searching. So the habit of searching doesn't mean anything about the separate self that doesn't exist. If that habit continues, then it doesn't mean that you aren't enlightened. It doesn't mean anything. And once it has been glimpsed that nothing can be attained and that no one can attain it, it is possible to let go. Again, if there is still a sense that understanding is important or necessary, the tendency will be to ask, who can let go? But make no effort to understand. Just let go. Let go of the tension that surrounds the compulsion to solve a problem or attain something or protect something. Soften. Release all effort. Be completely vulnerable and transparent. What's it like to be enlightened? Related to the theme of searching for it is the theme of trying to figure out what it's like to be enlightened. This stems from the assumption that something other than what is both possible and desirable. Fundamentally, the belief often is that something needs to change for me so that I can be at peace, that is enlightened. And so there is then an attempt to define the parameters of the search. How will I know when I'm there? We want to know. As we've already seen, there is no there. But still, the doubts remain. I've heard the special awakened people say that there is no enlightenment and that so-called awakening is a non-event happening for no one and that nothing changes. But they're probably either lying or speaking metaphorically. There's got to be something that changes, right? So let's be very, 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 very clear. Nothing changes. Nothing. Nothing needs to change. There is no enlightenment and therefore there is no sign of enlightenment. Does an enlightened person no longer think? No, because there are no enlightened people and no one thinks. Enlightened or otherwise. There may be thinking happening, but if and when it happens for no one. You may find this difficult to reconcile with your idea of reality, but the good news is that no idea of reality is a truthful description of reality. In truth, reality simply is and is the totality of what is. Nothing can be said about reality with any degree of accuracy because reality includes all that is, including any descriptions. Therefore, no description is about reality. Rather, descriptions are merely part of reality. Rest for just a moment. Notice if thinking happens. And notice if there is a thinker. Is the source of thought findable? Is there a findable director of thought? If no thinker can be found, then there already is no one thinking. Already it is the case that no one is thinking. Does thinking need to stop for enlightenment to occur? No, of course not, because there is no enlightenment and there is no one to whom it could even occur. Thinking already is not occurring for someone. So who cares if thinking happens? It's completely inconsequential. What about Kundalini? Does enlightenment require a Kundalini experience? No, it does not because there is no enlightenment and all experience is equally meaningless. So-called Kundalini experience is not fundamentally different than taking a shit or eating or commuting to work. Shit merely happens. It doesn't happen to anyone or by anyone. And none of it means anything. For many of us, the conditioning that the contents of experience are significant is very strong, and as such it can be challenging to relax the compulsion to try to understand what experience means. But consider for a second, what is the meaning of a sunrise? What is the meaning of a book? What is the meaning of a tree? What is the meaning of running? See that there is no meaning. Does enlightenment mean that the sense of being someone will disappear? No, it does not because there is no enlightenment and because what is called the sense of being someone never had any meaning. It certainly doesn't mean that there is someone. Take a look at what is called the sense of being someone. What is it? What is the proof that it signifies the existence of someone? Is there any absolute foundation for that knowledge? Or was it only ever just an assumption? There are feelings, sensations, thoughts, images, and concepts. That is all. But none of it actually references anything. Try as you might, you cannot find the center, the actual separate self. Since the so-called sense of being someone never meant anything, it never was happening for anyone, and it never had a reference point, why would it need to change or disappear? It never mattered. It never signified anything. It still doesn't matter. It still doesn't signify anything. Like everything else that happens, it is perfectly welcome. Does enlightenment mean that you will feel at one with everything? No, it does not because there is no enlightenment and because what is called feeling at one with everything is totally meaningless. Furthermore, feeling at one with everything is still conceptual garbage presuming that there is someone at the center and that there is an everything with which to be one. But for just a second, relax. Rest. Rest completely for just a millisecond. Are there any boundaries? I'm not talking about conceptual boundaries. I'm not talking about the idea of skin or wall. I'm talking about real, honest to goodness, absolutely certain boundaries. Can you find them? If there is no effort to understand anything, no movement whatsoever for just a millisecond, then boundaries cannot be found. Just for that millisecond. Doubt may arise a millisecond later. But in that 1 millisecond there is true seeing, just seeing without the arbitrary assignment of meaning. Does enlightenment mean that you will feel only loving feelings? No, it does not, because there is no enlightenment and because so-called loving feelings are only meaningless feelings happening for no one. That has always been the case and will always be the case. Feelings may be perceived as pleasant or unpleasant, but in a single moment of rest, it is clear that feelings are only feelings and they have no inherent meaning. Loving feelings happen. Non-loving feelings happen. They happen for no one. They do not indicate anything about anyone because there is no one for them to mean anything about. They cannot mean anything because they reference nothing. Stop trying to figure it all out. There's nothing to understand. Boundaries. I speak or write about boundaries often. I suggest that if you want to see what is as it is, without the unnecessary baggage, then question the assumptions, and one way to do that is to actually try to find the boundaries that you imagine to exist. When you cannot find them, then like the fruitless search for Santa Claus, eventually there may be a giving up of the belief as reality. The trouble is that people often insist that there are boundaries. I look, but the boundaries are still there, people will write to me. Of course, anything is possible, including boundaries. The nature of reality is that it is limitless, so there are no constraints. But at the same time, the nature of reality is too the unknowable and unfindable. So if you think that you have found a boundary, then I suggest you look again. And look with fresh innocence. Just for a moment let go of the baggage and armoring of knowing and understanding. The knowing and understanding aren't accurate descriptions of reality. They are just concepts, just symbols. Reality is what is here prior to concepts and symbols, the substanceless substance of concepts and symbols. If you want to explore this, start with something that seems like a boundary. For example, go to a wall. Close your eyes. Touch the wall. Is there a boundary? If you say yes, then how do you know? What is the proof of a boundary? The sensation is the only possible proof. So in truth, all that you have is a sensation. That is it. It's not a boundary, it's a sensation. Then, let's explore the sensation. Notice that the sensation has qualities. Perhaps it is smooth and cool. Whatever the qualities, is there a sensation apart from the qualities? Or is the sensation only a collection of qualities? In other words, isn't a sensation merely a concept with no actual substance or center? If you took away the qualities of sensation, would there be a sensation? Next, open your eyes. What changes? All that changes is that visual information is added. So what is the visual information? Color? Light? Shadow? The color, light, and shadow, and whatever else may be apparently seen are the qualities. Is there anything there other than the qualities? If you took away the color, light, and shadow, would there be anything to see? What was imagined to be a boundary cannot be found. What is there? Qualities. Only qualities. That is it. No boundary. Even the qualities aren't quite there, if we're honest. Can you actually find the qualities? Can you find the substance of them? Or are they only concepts in imagination? Go ahead. Test this out. See if you can find any boundary. And when you cannot, rest in the unknowing. My experience, your experience. I get variations on the question of my experience, your experience very frequently. One man has asked me repeatedly, if you and I are both looking at a fire hydrant, aren't we both seeing something different? Other people phrase it differently, simply asking, isn't all experience personal? There are a million versions of the question, but it boils down to mistaking concept for primary reality. Or, put another way, it involves a mistaken belief that ideas are a valid way to divide reality. So I invite people to relax and rest completely for just a second and see that the true nature of reality as it is has nothing whatsoever to do with concepts. Or, put another way, concept doesn't reference reality, concept is merely concept and it isn't about anything. When this is seen, even just for a second, then it is possible to disregard all concepts, thoughts, images, ideas, and interpretations and instead acknowledge the primacy of non-conceptual reality despite the fact that non-conceptual reality cannot be understood or known in the way we normally conceive of understanding or knowing. I invite you to let go and rest thoroughly right now in order to explore this yourself. For even just a second, soften all the armor, all the compulsion to know or figure things out. Let go completely. Just for half a second. Relax the body. Make no effort to understand anything or find anything that you imagine to be hidden. In this half a second of rest, can you find your experience? Can you find my experience? Can you find any boundaries around experience that divide it in any way? Is there anything at all that is outside of the simple, non-conceptual, effortless experiencing that is apparently happening? Sometimes people answer that they can find their experience. And certainly, anything is possible, but it's highly unlikely that you can actually find your experience non-conceptually. If you think that you have found your experience, then soften more. Be very lazy. Be so lazy that you cannot be bothered to watch a thought or listen to a thought or chase after a thought. Make no effort to understand, know, or label. Relax that much. Just for a second. Don't worry about forever. Just relax that much for 1 second. And then see if you can actually find your experience. Or is the just experiencing apparently happening without boundaries and without a center? Perhaps even to say that much is too much. If you are perfectly still for just a second, then in truth nothing happens. The difficulty is that sometimes we get hung up on trying to see or experience something different. We imagine that what is not enough or is wrong in some way, we think that what is a problem. And to try to solve the supposed problem, we chase after some fabled thing called enlightenment or awakening or whatever we are dreaming about. Yet in this single moment of rest, nothing changes. The seeing/feeling/experiencing/nothing is exactly the same as it ever was. And you may tell yourself, this is not my beautiful house. That is perfectly fine and to be expected precisely because nothing was ever missing or wrong. So in this moment of rest, the okayness of what is simply seen rather than overlooked. That's all. So if in this moment of rest everything is essentially the same as ever, then that's great. Don't go looking for something different. Don't expect something dramatic to happen. Don't expect fireworks or the hand of God to validate the simple clarity of not knowing. Just rest and let this be enough as it already is. When doubts arise, and they usually do, it may be useful to take a moment to look and see that, in this second of rest, there are no findable boundaries. And this second of clarity can reveal that there never were any boundaries. There were only concepts that masqueraded as boundaries. But even those concepts cannot be found since they lack substance. So this 1 second of rest reveals the boundless, impersonal, aliveness that is all that is. Intellectual understanding. If I had a nickel for every time I've received an email in which the author states that he or she has an intellectual understanding of non-duality, I'd probably have about $12.50, because a lot of people believe this story. I can empathize because I believed that story too for a long time. I would sit in meetings with so-called awakened people and hear the same thing over and over. There is no separate individual, there is no choice, etc. So I believed that I understood it. The thing about this story is that it is wrong, but only always. Why? Because no one understands. Really? No one. I don't. You don't. Ramana didn't. Nisargadatta didn't. Rupert Spira doesn't. Eckhart Tolle doesn't. Byron Katie doesn't. And neither does anyone else you might think understands. No one can understand because there is no one to understand and there is nothing to understand. That is the discovery. Nothing to understand, no one to understand it, and this is peace. In a sense, therefore, all supposed understanding is an obstacle to the clarity of the present peace that is always already the case. Of course, nothing can truly be an obstacle. But the insistence that I understand seems to produce an overlooking of what is obvious. Because what is obvious can only be seen with the innocence of not knowing. If there is a true admittance of not knowing, then the clarity of pure seeing is obvious, nothing is laid on top. Without the baggage of supposed understanding and knowing, there is no grasping, no clinging, because there is no concept of anyone separate from anything else who could or would need to grasp or cling. We make a mistake of elevating and revering so-called awakened people and still trying to fit them into our model of reality. Our model of reality is usually hierarchical, and we've placed so-called awakened people higher up, ascribing great personal wisdom and knowledge to them. So we listen to them and try to understand what they are talking about because we mistakenly believe that they arrived at their elevated position above the suffering of the world. By means of acquiring knowledge and understanding, we hope that they might be contagious. We want to catch their understanding, we want to see what they see and know what they know. Yet rarely has it occurred to us that maybe we can take these people at face value. When they say that they aren't special and that they know nothing and that the way is not a way of acquiring knowledge, maybe, just maybe, they are telling the truth. So to be clear, so-called awakening is not a special state that happens to a special person. Neither is it the result of acquiring knowledge or understanding. So-called awakening does not happen because one has worked hard enough and long enough to find some hidden truth. So-called awakening is the transparency of all belief and all story. So-called awakening is the clarity that no understanding is needed, that no one can understand, and nothing can be understood. So-called awakening is ordinary and simple and totally unobtainable, which may sound really discouraging. But note that I'm not saying that so-called awakening cannot be discovered. I just said that it cannot be obtained for the simple fact that there is nothing to obtain and no one to obtain it. So-called awakening is the acknowledgement that there is nothing other than awakening. This is already it. There is no need to search for something else. As usual, I'll invite you right now to rest for just a second. Don't move. Let go of all the tension for even just a fraction of a second. See how in this moment of rest there is no need to understand. In fact, there is no possibility of understanding because there is no one separate who can understand nor any boundaries around what is allowing for any sort of understanding to take place. There is just the totally inconceivable obviousness of what is. And this is enough. Why is it all about me? Sometimes people ask, you say that there is no separate self, but then why is it that everything seems to be about me? Everything seems to be happening to me, thoughts are about me. What's up with that? Not surprisingly, this question reveals that there remain unquestioned assumptions that are believed to be true. Essentially, the underlying assumption is that the cited phenomena are actually about someone or that they belong to someone. It can be very useful to question the assumption. Some people start with the assumption that the Christian Bible is the inerrant word of some guy named God, who is believed to be omnipotent and the creator of all that is excepting, presumably, himself. When someone starts with that assumption, everything gets interpreted through that lens. So, for example, when carbon dating of dinosaur bones shows them to be 65 million years old, people who believe in the literal biblical account book, the Earth itself is believed to be only 6,000 years old by those who interpret the story in that way. In other words, the assumption that the Earth is 6,000 years old is the lens through which some people view everything, causing them to disregard anything that is incongruent with that assumption. If we believed that Santa Claus was real, then we'd have to find ways to explain all his supposed activities. We'd have to assign all kinds of special powers to him, giving him the ability to travel around the world in a single night, delivering gifts to everyone, except those poor non-believers who have to receive gifts from mere mortals, or worse yet, those non-believers who don't even receive gifts. But the assumption that the Earth is 6,000 years old and the assumption that Santa Claus exists don't actually have any influence on reality as it is, they merely influence the way in which reality is interpreted. So obviously, interpretation isn't necessary or even all that useful. We could dispense with belief and interpretation and reality would remain as it is. In the same way, if we start with the assumption that there is a separate self, an individual called me, then everything that happens gets interpreted through that lens. Yet also in the same way, the assumption and the interpretation don't influence reality as it is in the least. So here's my suggestion, just drop the assumption and the interpretation. Do it just for a moment. See that without the assumption of a separate self, reality remains exactly as it is. In other words, experience is exactly the same whether it is interpreted through the lens of a separate self or not. Put another way, the separate self was nothing more than an assumption. When looking without the baggage of assumption, the simple clarity of reality as it is remains perfectly obvious. Stuff happens, but what evidence is there that it references a separate self? Is there any proof that experience is your experience? We've already explored that together, so if there is doubt, revisit that exploration earlier in the book. What about thoughts? Is there any proof that thoughts are your thoughts? In a moment of rest, it can be seen that all so-called thoughts are happening without a reference point. There is no findable thinker. And even if the content of thoughts tell a story about a person, that only means that the thoughts tell a story about a person. The me character is no different than Santa Claus, it is just a character in a story. That's it. Because if you look, you cannot actually find the one that the thoughts seem to reference. There's no one there to reference. It can seem as though experience is happening from a vantage point. But this is purely conceptual because in a moment of rest, no other perspective can be found, dissolving the assumption that experience can be divided into self and other. There is no other. There is nothing else. There is not even a vantage point because what is all that is. There is no other vantage point, so to speak of any vantage point, even a singular vantage point, is misleading since this is the totality. Look for the boundaries of this so-called vantage point and it will be clear that it is boundless, infinite. There is only this. Cause and effect. Another variation on the choice/no choice question is the question of spontaneity versus cause and effect. I have frequently made statements regarding the spontaneous nature of reality, and I have received questions from people wondering how that is possible since it seems as though things happen in sequence and it seems as though there exists cause and effect. What makes this question slightly different than the choice/no choice question is that it tends to rely more heavily upon the assumption of time and the relationship of so-called distinct events. Alan Watts had a lovely metaphor regarding a cat and a crack in a fence that he used frequently. I recall first reading it in the book, On the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are. I can see why he liked the metaphor, because it really is apt in many scenarios. He would present the metaphor as follows: imagine that you are someone who has never seen a cat. You are standing on one side of a fence with a narrow slit in it. A cat walks by on the other side of the fence and, looking through the slit, you first see the head, then the body, then the tail. The cat walks back and forth several times, so the phenomenon repeats. Since you've no idea what a cat is, you may well interpret the situation to mean that a head causes a body and a body causes a tail, whereas, in fact, it's just a cat. Most of us are in the habit of viewing reality as though through a narrow slit in a fence. That narrow slit is called time. Of course, I'm being extremely generous in my use of metaphor. Obviously, We're not really looking through a slit in a fence. Rather, time is purely conceptual. But we imagine time to be something real, albeit intangible, invisible, and insubstantial, a bit like Santa Claus. Our belief in time causes us to imagine that what is can be divided up like a cat can be conceptually divided into head, body, and tail. But notice that not even a cat can actually be divided up. To do so would be the end of the cat. So if we want a cat, then we cannot divide it. The same is true of reality. So-called cause and effect is only possible conceptually because to actually divide reality is the end of reality, and, by the way, an impossibility. Another way to look at it is to see that no distinct events actually exist. In order to have cause and effect, the cause and the effect must be distinct. Otherwise, we cannot meaningfully speak of cause and effect, we can only speak of reality or totality. And that is the point, there is only reality, there is only totality. No separate events exist. If you don't yet see the truth of the statement that no separate events exist, then look closely for an event. Can you find one? Where is the beginning of an event? Where is the end? Let's take an example such as reading a book. Here you are, apparently, reading a book. We could say that this is an event. But can you find the beginning? Really look. Don't merely accept a concept for the answer. Many concepts may appear to provide an answer. The event began when I opened the book, you may say. Okay. But can you find the actual beginning of the opening of the book? Look closely. Finding the actual beginning to an event is essentially the same assignment as finding a boundary. Neither is possible because no such division exists. All that can be found are conceptual divisions. But when you look more closely to find the actual substance of the supposed division, nothing can be found, except, perhaps, another concept. This process can continue ad infinitum. So-called common sense tells us that we can experience boundaries. For that reason, we explored earlier to see that what gets called a boundary is really only a conceptual construct used to describe a collection of qualities that themselves are insubstantial. There is no boundary to be found. The beginnings and endings of events are even less substantial than boundaries. All we can say is that apparently reading is happening. And some memory occurring right now may present a sense of prior to reading. We then infer a beginning to the event. The same basic process occurs for the so-called end of the event because we can project, or remember, and in either case, the projection or memory is always happening right now. The sense of after reading. We then infer an end to the event. But in actuality, we cannot find the beginning nor the end of an event. Those beginnings and endings are fuzzy at best, and they are only even that substantial, which is to say, not substantial at all, if we go along with the story and don't question. Like a phantom caught out of the corner of your eye, when you look closely, nothing is there. Finally, the whole notion of time, upon which the concept of distinct events depends, can be seen for what it is, which is nothing more than a fantasy. It is an illusion. Like a mirage, the illusion of time itself exists, but the fantasy of what it means or references does not. A mirage can be mistaken for water. The illusion of time can be mistaken for something outside of this right now. But like chasing after a mirage will never quench your thirst, chasing after time will never satisfy. That's because, like a dog chasing his tail, the search for something else is only ever happening as the totality of what is. There is nothing else. Look for the past and what do you find? Is there anything there? Look for the future and what do you find? Is there anything there? Past, present, and future alike are only ever concepts, fantasies, illusions happening right now. Like everything else, the closer one looks, the less one finds. How could there be anything other than spontaneity? This right now as it is all that is. There is nothing outside of this, there never was. There is no time for cause and effect. There is no division to be found. Location. On more than one occasion, I have been presented with questions regarding the location of consciousness. Often it is suggested that the brain is the seat of consciousness. This seems to be troubling to those who suggest it, and they want some sort of argument that can convince them that consciousness exists outside of the brain. Basically, they seem to want to escape death, and they imagine that if they could believe that consciousness exists outside of the brain, which seemingly must surely die, then consciousness is immortal, neatly avoiding death. The trouble with this question is that it presumes too much. First of all, it assumes that there is such a thing as consciousness. Secondly, it assumes that there is such a thing as a location. Thirdly, it assumes that there is someone who can be identified with consciousness, to either die or escape death. And finally, it assumes that death is something other than what is happening right now. Let's take a look at each of these assumptions. Like we have seen earlier, if we assume that there is such a thing as Santa Claus, then we may feel compelled to trouble ourselves with all the problems posed by his existence. Then we might feel that we need to know where he lives, what he does, and whether he can benefit us or harm us. In the same way, if we assume that consciousness exists, then we may feel compelled to understand it. But before we get all wound up about it, let's see if we can actually find consciousness. The problem with consciousness is that it is so vague that it's difficult to know where to begin looking for it. Merriam-Webster defines consciousness as the totality in psychology of sensations, perceptions, ideas, attitudes, and feelings of which an individual or a group is aware at any given time or within a given time span. In other words, it's merely a conceptual construct used to describe a collection of qualities. In other words, there's nothing there. We may contrast consciousness with so-called unconsciousness, such as may be inferred from the memory or absence of memory, of an aesthetic. But if you look closely, you'll see that so-called unconsciousness doesn't actually exist. It is an inference only, since it cannot possibly be experienced. Unconsciousness is the idea of the absence of experience. And if consciousness is only defined in contrast to that which clearly does not exist, then the definition is meaningless. Or, another way to look at it is to see if you can find the boundaries of consciousness. Is there any beginning or ending to consciousness? Of course, I'm not suggesting a conceptual investigation. I'm suggesting looking right now without concept to see if the actual boundaries of consciousness can be found. If we cannot find a thing or anything other than the thing, what are we even talking about? Consciousness is a complete conceptual fabrication. There's absolutely no substance there. It's made up like the Easter Bunny, except less furry, or the Lucky Charms leprechaun, except less obsessed with artificially colored marshmallows. Next, can you find location? Location is always relative. Always. There is always relative to here. East is relative to west. Up is relative to down. We can give what seem to be absolute locations such as Earth, but where's that? If you are already here, on Earth, in this case, then the location isn't a location, it's just a synonym for here, and as we'll see, here doesn't even exist. But if you're not on Earth, then an absolute location won't do you any good. You'd need to know how to get here from there. In other words, all location is relative, otherwise it's not location, it's just a meaningless concept. But then the question begs to be asked, what is the reference point? The reference point is always assumed to be here, wherever that is. But then where is here? Notice that here isn't actually a location, it's just a concept to obfuscate the fact that there's no here. There's just the same unfindability that is discovered, yet not found, when looking for boundaries or events. That's because here, like boundaries and events, doesn't actually reference anything real. There is no center, no reference point from which to judge location. Without a here there is no there. There is no location. What about the one who could identify with consciousness? This is the one we're afraid might die. This is the one we want to protect. And if there was something here to protect, then it would be sensible. But is there? Can you find anyone here? Is there anything tangible? Is there any substance? Is there anything that you can say, yeah, that's definitely something? Normally we justify the intense, chronic armoring of the imagined self because it feels that we must. But how is it that a feeling is proof of the existence of a self? Isn't a feeling just a feeling? How do you know what a feeling means? Are you certain that you're right? Are you certain that feelings mean anything at all? And furthermore, and bringing it right back to the heart of the matter, is there any evidence that the feeling is yours? Does it actually have a reference point? Or was the self about whom the feeling supposedly was about and to whom the feeling supposedly belonged only ever just an inference? And then there's death, the thing we want to protect ourselves from. But what is this demon we're so afraid of? Have we ever really taken a good look? I used to be hesitant to comment on death because I felt somehow unqualified. But then I realized the foolishness of such a stance because it only maintains the status of death as something else. Yet a simple, honest examination of what is reveals that death is not something else. In fact, death is, like so many other things that we imagine, unfindable. When we look for death, all we find is the same unfindability, the emptiness that is all that is. Go ahead and look. Can you find death? The closer you look, the more it dissolves, revealing the perfect insecurity that is life. Death is not the opposite of life and life is not the opposite of death. Neither exists as such, but both point to the open, unknowable, completely insecure nature of reality. There's nothing to find here. There's nothing to grasp here. There's no reference point. There's no meaning. The search for enlightenment or awakening or whatever story we have believed is the search for nothing. We were lured with a carrot on a stick, thinking that we were going to get something of great value. We imagined that we would escape the thing we most fear, death. But it turns out that what is revealed is that death cannot be escaped because it is the inescapable emptiness and insecurity of reality. Death seems terrifying because it is imagined to be something other than what is. So we contract and armor in hopes of being able to defend ourselves from this horror. Ironically, there's nothing here to protect. Let go for just a second and let this be clear. There's nothing here. There's nothing to live or die. There's nothing to secure. This is freedom. How to let go? Still, for many people the question remains, how do I let go? People get hung up on this in a few different ways. One of the most popular ways in which people get hung up on this is by trying to understand. Hopefully, we've already taken care of that matter, but just for the sake of clarity, let me state that you cannot understand nor is understanding necessary or helpful. The main point people want to understand is how to reconcile the instruction to let go, relax, soften, drop it, stop, etc. with the fact that there exists no one who can do nor choose to do anything. This is very frustrating because these ideas seem irreconcilable. However, the good news is that nothing needs to be reconciled because reality already allows for everything, including all paradoxes. Including the paradox that although no one can choose or do anything, apparently the instruction can be done. Ironically, trying to understand and indulging that compulsion to reconcile is a failure to take the advice to heart because the advice is to stop doing stuff. Relax. Don't try. Don't put forth any effort. Don't seek to understand. Just give up. The second manner in which people commonly get hung up on this matter of letting go is that they try to employ a magical approach. They hope that by willing letting go with a magical incantation such as let go now, the letting go will happen. It could work that way, of course, because anything is possible. But it's unlikely, and a more direct approach generally works better. All the instructions are probably best understood as physical instructions. In other words, physically let go, physically relax. Notice where in the body there is tension, and to whatever extent the tension is voluntary, let go. The tension is usually habitual and conditioned, so keep letting go. Don't argue with it. Don't analyze it. Don't worry about it. Just keep letting go. Now, people will come up with all kinds of objections. They will often object to physically letting go because it doesn't seem spiritual enough, or because it seems too simple or too mundane. Or, they'll object because they argue that there is no body and therefore physical relaxation is only an illusion. So let's address these one at a time. Part of the trap of spiritual searching is that it creates the idea of being special and elevates that idea to be desirable. Then, arbitrary divisions get made where some types of experience are classified as spiritual and good while others are classified as mundane and bad. But these divisions are, as I have said, arbitrary, and any division is conceptual, not true, and deceptive. So it is useful to be willing to be vulnerable and humble and just let go of all that nonsense. Regarding the objection that physical relaxation is only an illusion, that much is true in a sense. But everything we can communicate about is an illusion. It is all a story. But within the story we may point to that which is prior to the story. So yes, if you look, you may see that it is impossible to find the physical body. But if you are willing to be humble and vulnerable, you will also see that despite the unfindability of the physical body it is possible, nonetheless, to follow the instruction to relax physical tension. That's because the instruction is a pointer, and it is generally a much more useful pointer than suggesting that one should let go of thoughts or let go of sin or let go of karma or anything else that is several orders of magnitude more abstract than relax physical tension. Anyway, give it a whirl. Just let go. Keep letting go. Others. Many people ask about others, relationships, duty, responsibility, and morality, which I'll lump together as one theme since it is all founded upon the notion of there being a separation. The questions that come up in this theme include things like, how should I treat other people? Should I feel lovingly toward everyone? And what is the role of forgiveness in non-duality? The trouble with all these questions is that they presume that there exists some sort of framework from which anything can be judged as right or wrong, good or bad. But I'm reminded of the story of the Chinese farmer as I've heard it told by Alan Watts. The story is as follows: a Chinese farmer's horse goes missing. His neighbors come by and say, "Isn't that terrible?" And he says, "Maybe." The next day the horse comes back and his neighbors say, "Isn't that wonderful?" And he says, "Maybe." His son goes riding on the horse, gets bucked, and falls and breaks his leg. The neighbors say, "Isn't that terrible?" And he says, "Maybe." When the army representatives come by the following day to conscript his son into the army, they don't conscript him on account of his broken leg. The neighbors say, "Isn't that wonderful?" And he says, "Maybe." How can we judge any of this when we don't even know what it is? We cannot find a reference point. We cannot find anything to call ourselves or other. We cannot find any actual substance. There is only the obviousness of what is, which is too immediate and too boundless to have any idea what it is. In fact, effectively, it is nothing. How should I treat other people? These sorts of questions are impossible to answer in any way other than to simply say, "As you do." That sounds flip, but it's the only honest answer. And even then, it's misleading because it implies that someone is doing something. The problem is that we isolate, separate, the behavior from the context, which is only possible conceptually, but not actually. This is what we do with everything. We imagine that it is possible for something to exist in isolation despite the fact that nothing exists in isolation. In fact, there is no discrete phenomenon or object whatsoever. It's back to the cat again, it's inseparable. We imagine that we want the security of knowing. In this case, we want to know what to do or how to act. But since this moment is always absolutely fresh and spontaneous and unique, how could it be possible to know? Religions preach morality and governments enforce morality. But morality is a fiction because what is always unknowable and completely out of control. And the so-called behavior that occurs in this moment is always synonymous with this moment. Like a glove that fits perfectly, the behavior is only precisely whatever couldn't be otherwise, given the context. Look at it another way. It's possible to use electrical stimulation applied to precise locations of the brain in order to produce predictable behavior. Or, to put it in terms that more of us may be able to relate to, taking the tiniest little bit of LSD can destroy the universe we imagined to exist. Or, consider that a little bit of pollen can produce intense allergic reactions. Why is anything else any different? Why are some behaviors imagined to be independent of the context? Furthermore, for morality to exist there has to be someone to account for the choices. But is there a chooser? Can you find one? Take a look. Where is your supposed chooser? Can you find any trace of him or her? What about forgiveness? Notice that true forgiveness has nothing whatsoever to do with what we usually imagine it to be about. We usually conceive of it being about self and other one forgiving the other. But in actuality, forgiveness is the letting go of the entirety of that whole mess. Forgiveness is tossing the whole burden to the wind and discovering that there's nothing there. True forgiveness is the discovery that there is no self and no other. It is the discovery that this is already it. Nothing needs to be done. All questions about morality, judgment, others, responsibility, and so forth are futile attempts to understand and protect. Give them up. Just stop. Just for a moment. Let it all go. Make no effort. Really? Just drop it all. 1 second. That's all. Rest for just 1 second. Now, where'd all that stuff go to? Whatever seemed so important perhaps just a minute ago, what about now? Is it important now? Is anything important now? When we drop all the concern about all of this useless stuff, that doesn't suddenly turn us into sadistic monsters loosed upon the world. We don't cut everyone off, flip old women the bird for no reason, and slap people around. At least not unless we used to do that, in which case, ironically, we probably do it less or at least less vehemently. The thing is, there never was any separation. There never was a chooser. There never was anyone to censor or control nor anyone who could do the censoring or controlling. Everything is always already uncontrolled and spontaneous whether that is believed or not. So giving up on the fixation on thoughts and images won't change anything, it will just reveal the natural ease and effortlessness that is already the case. What is this? Finally, for now, at least, people sometimes ask, what the hell is this that you're always going on about? That's because I apparently make many statements regarding the obviousness of what is, using the expression this to point to the immediacy of what is. In many ways, it is good that people ask because at least then they are admitting that they don't know. Those who don't ask, on the other hand, either know that they don't know, and are okay with that, or they think they know, which is trouble. Admitting that you don't know is always good, when you really mean it, because knowing is not possible. So you can be assured that when I use the word this, I am definitely not pointing to something knowable. When I speak or write about this, I am pointing to what is totally incomprehensible and yet utterly immediate and obvious. This is inescapable and unavoidable. This is the totality. As I've already said, on the one hand there are those who think they know. Those who think they know will be best off questioning that assumption. Take a look. What do you really know? What is the foundation upon which that knowledge rests? And is that foundation solid and unshakable? Or is the foundation itself actually insubstantial? Ultimately, all so-called knowledge is completely without substance. It cannot be found. There is nothing there. On the other hand, there are those who don't know. Among those who don't know, there are those who have discovered that freedom reveals itself in the abandon of not knowing, instead looking with innocence and freshness. But there are also those who know that they don't know but who still believe that it is possible and desirable to know. They are the ones who keep seeking to know what this refers to. So let me assure you that this refers to nothing. There is nothing to which anything can refer. Take a look. See the unfindable nature of reality. Look for anything and see that it is impossible to find. As we've explored together throughout this book, we've seen that all finding or knowing depends upon boundaries of some sort. But as we've also seen, these boundaries cannot be found. They are merely conceptual, and concepts are insubstantial. True, there may appear to be qualities of experience, as a so-called wall may have the qualities of smoothness and coolness. But take away the qualities which themselves are insubstantial, and nothing remains. When I suggest that this is it, that this is all that is, I am not referring to a concrete, knowable, findable thing of any sort. I am actually pointing to the looking itself. Looking is always fresh and unburdened. Looking is pure innocence. When I speak of this, I am inviting you to notice the looking, to see the innocence and openness that you already are. There is nothing special here to find. Nothing is hidden. This isn't something you need to find or work harder to understand. There is no secret code or puzzle to decipher. I'm not speaking in riddles. In fact, I'm being as plain as possible. I really, truly, and honestly mean just this right now as it is. Don't look for it. Just notice the looking. Notice the boundless nature of what is. Notice the immediacy of what is. Before any concepts seem to mediate, notice that the rawness of what is perfectly obvious. This is what I am talking about. Nothing else. Just this. You cannot miss it. You are absolutely guaranteed that whatever happens, this is what I am intended. Just this. Whether seemingly ordinary or extraordinary, this is it. Stop looking for something else. Happiness Made Simple e-course. I hope that you have enjoyed this book. If so, then I'd like to invite you to attend my Happiness Made Simple e-course. In this completely free e-course, you will discover just how easily attainable true happiness is. Instead of arduous affirmations, techniques, and visualizations, in this e-course you'll learn how to tune into the effortless happiness that is already here when you know how to look. Sign up for free at my website, www.joeylett.com. When you do, you'll begin receiving Happiness Made Simple in a series of emails delivered directly to your inbox. This e-course comes with no strings attached. I promise you there are no sleazy internet marketing hooks involved. You have my word. As a subscriber, you will also be able to read all of my future books for free. Connect with me. I welcome your questions, comments, and feedback of any kind. Please feel free to email me at joeylett@gmail.com. I am now receiving so many emails that I cannot always reply to every email. I do read them all, and I do my best to reply to as many as possible. For the benefit of others, I may choose to publish my response to your email on my blog or in book format. I will maintain your privacy and anonymity if I choose to publish my response. One small favor. My sincere goal in writing is to share something that may be of value to you. And I endeavor to do so while keeping the costs low for readers. The success of my books and my ability to reach other readers who may benefit from my books depends in large part on having lots of thoughtful, honest reviews written about my work. You would do me a great favor if you would please take a moment to generously write a review of this book at Amazon.com. This will only take a few minutes of your time, and you will be helping me a great deal. I sure would appreciate it. T.